Okay, so let's have a look at an example of what this means in practice. So that means that if I have my lamp and I double the distance from the plant, okay, so like I did with this one here, I've doubled the distance. If the distance is doubled, my light intensity changes, and it changes inversely proportional to the new distance squared. So inversely proportional means 1 divided by, and the new distance squared, so I've doubled it, so it would be 2 squared, which gives me a quarter. So that means that my light intensity is now a quarter of the original value. If, however, my distance is halved, okay, my value is still inversely proportional, so I do 1 divided by, and this time I do 1 divided by a half squared, which is the same as 1 divided by a quarter. And in maths, when you do fractions, if you're dividing by fractions, remember you flip this one over and then you multiply it. So that would be 1 times 4 divided by 1. I've flip that one over, so that gives me an answer of 4. So that means if I half my distance, my light intensity is now 4 times greater. So if I move my lamp from here to here, I would increase my light intensity 4 times. And that's right, we know that this is working because here my light intensity was 20, I halved the distance and it moves to 80. 4 times 20 is 80. Going back the other way, if I'm double the distance here, I've quartered my light intensity. Okay, so you have to understand how 3 different types of plants are adapted to the environment they live in, and how in particular they prevent water loss from occurring by transpiration. So the 3 that you need to know about are deciduous trees, the second type you have to know about are conifers, or coniferous trees, and then thirdly you have to know about cactus plants. So these are the 3 that you have to know. So let's look at deciduous trees first. So deciduous trees are trees that lose their leaves during the winter. So we've got quite a lot of those in the UK. So examples might be an oak tree, birch tree, sycamore tree, apple trees, etc. Any tree that loses their leaves is referred to as a deciduous tree. And the reason, there's lots of reasons why they actually might lose their leaves, but the reason that you have to be aware of in terms of water loss is that if you imagine in the winter, the soil becomes frozen, so any water that might be present in the soil is actually frozen. And so what that means for the plant or the tree is if this were the tree here, if the tree had leaves, then transpiration would be occurring and water would be being lost from those leaves, and the plant wouldn't then be able to replace that water because the water in the soil would be frozen. So one of the reasons why deciduous trees lose their leaves is thought to be so that without leaves there's no water loss, and so they don't have to worry about replacing that frozen water. Right, the second type then are conifers. So conifers are trees like your typical Christmas tree, okay, and rather than having leaves, they actually have needles on their stems, okay, so it would be a bit like this, okay, so they have needles, and the needles are the equivalent of the tree's leaves. And by having needles, what that means is that the leaves now all of a sudden have a lower surface area, so there is less surface for water to be lost by transpiration. If you've ever felt pine needles as well, like ones that come off a Christmas tree, they have a very thick cuticle. So waxy cuticle on the top is really thick, and that also helps to prevent water loss. The other thing is that in the winter, it's obviously more windy in the UK or in parts of the world, and so the wind is less likely to blow these trees over. If you imagine that deciduous tree with its great big plumage of leaves all over it, actually it's more likely to be blown over than this one. So it allows them to withstand strong winds, and also it allows them to collect less snow. Again, with this tree, okay, if you had an enormous amount of leaves on that tree and the leaves have got a large surface area, as the snow fell, it would fall onto those leaves and it would cause branches to crack and for it to bend over. Here, a lot of the snow will pass through the pine needles. Okay, so the third type is the cactus. Now we know you probably know quite a lot about cactuses, but cactuses have a very thick stem, okay, and this stem is swollen with water. Okay, so they fill their stem with water as a water reserve. So the stem has water, fleshy stem with water inside, and again the cactus has spines rather than having leaves. So spines all over it like this, and again that means that first of all it stops the cactus from being eaten by herbivores. So that would be herbivores, organisms that eat plants. It also opens its stomata during the night. So then when it's cooler in the desert, or in the conditions that the cactus would grow, by opening the stomata at night, carbon dioxide is able to diffuse into the air spaces or into the cactus, and then it stores that carbon dioxide, and the stomata shut during the day. So it's stored that carbon dioxide ready for the next day's photosynthesis. The spines on the cactus also mean that these have a much smaller surface area, same as the conifers, so actually less water is lost by transpiration. There are two other things that cacti and other plants actually do to try and prevent water loss by transpiration. The first thing is that sometimes their stomata, rather than being on the underside of the cell, which is what we looked at previously, just normally, okay, what they do is they actually have their stomata sunk inside, sort of back in through the leaf. So if I show you, so you might have your guard cells here, and then you'd have your epidermal cells, and they would come around like this. So the stomata actually looks like it's tucked inside the leaf, and you'd have the rest of the leaf in here. So this would be the outside. And what that means for cacti and for other plants, and they could give you a question on this for another type of plant, is that it traps water vapor in this region here. If you imagine the wind blowing past this part of the leaf, it can't get into this region very well, and so water vapor is trapped here. And that means that we get a high concentration around this part of the leaf. So water from the air spaces in the leaf, therefore diffusion is slow out because I don't have a very steep gradient. Okay, if I had this much water in the plant, this much water outside, you can see that there's quite a steep gradient there, so quickly water will move from high to low. If, however, I have a greater amount of water on the outside, like I've got in this example here, then actually less water will move from high to low because the gradient here is less steep than here. So this is a steep gradient and this is less steep. Okay, so by accumulating water vapor just outside the stomata, just outside the leaf, it means that less water vapor is lost from the leaf. The other thing that plants also do is, and cacti, some cacti do this as well, is that they have little hairs around their stomata. So again, they still might have their sunken stomata or stomata in pits, like in the example above, but they also have little tiny hairs here around the stomata, or around the stoma. And what they do is, again, they trap that water vapor. So sunken stomata themselves will do it, but by having the hairs, you're also trapping a lot more water. Okay, so exactly the same principle, that if you have a high concentration, for instance with no hairs or no sunken stomata, the wind blows that water vapor away and it quickly diffuses out of the leaf. If the concentration gradient isn't very steep, less water is being lost.